Okay, so if you have been to Scale Climate Action before, you know the drill. Feel free to ask any questions. I hope you guys have made some notes while they were giving their talks. Amazing talks. Can I please have another round of applause for both of these guys? I hope you feel inspired as I do. And I hope also that you have a lot of interesting questions to ask. These are some industry experts that normally we don't have access to, and they are here, available for us. Big, huge thank you for them being around and giving our times. So I will just open up for the crowd. I see George, please.
Thank you both. Great talks. Thanks for showing the urgency and the scale of the problem. I have a question, probably for both of you in a way, but you decide who answers. You've shown Matt that Max that the early stage ventures, that's not very much happens, but most of the capital comes in later, where things are a bit more clear. Whereas you go in the early stage. Can you talk a little bit about the failure rate that you see in this early stage? Like, how many of the initiatives that you find and work with will actually be successful in the climate space?
Yeah, I'll take that one first. So basically, if we look at those 4 different stages that I was showing earlier, the highest failure rate usually happens at that first stage, right? It's like somebody came up with an idea, they're not even launching it, right? That's like, I don't know, maybe upwards of 90% failure rate if I had to put a number to it. But then as you get in later and later stages, that failure rate starts to come down quite a bit. But sort of what punctuates that value to that I was talking about is, I think you see, especially in the climate space now, since I think VCs are still trying to figure out how to do due diligence on climate tech startups and understand the space better, you see this mismatch of capital that happens, or at least a mismatch of expectations in the return profile of that investment, right? So you're starting to see a lot of these mainstream, to use mainstream in air quotes, VCs that are now looking at the climate space. You've got big one like AC Ventures, they have a head of ESG, East Ventures, they've got a head of sustainability. So VCs are starting to pay attention to the space. But then you actually talk to the founders who are trying to raise in that sort of stage of that value of debt that I was showing. There's a mismatch. So I'll give you one example to make it super clear. A couple of good friends of mine, they're the founders of this air purification startup called Nafas. You've probably heard of them, you've probably seen their app. They basically help detect the air AQI, the air quality index in Indonesia, and then they also sell filters, right? And actually what they really needed to scale was not traditional equity venture capital, but what they needed was purchase order financing. They had a backlog of hundreds of thousands of dollars of purchase order financing. You can imagine the supply chain. They've got manufacturing in China, final assembly in Indonesia. They've got customers here. They've also got customers overseas. They really needed purchase order financing to help smooth that working capital gap. VCs don't really provide that, right? So they needed to find alternative ways of financing that. And that's when you see that failure rates start to increase, because these VCs, they don't understand that financing need because they don't have the right mechanism for doing that. They don't have the right structure in the fund to do that. And founders need to educate the VCs, look, I don't actually need this equity capital for 5-year return, 100x return. Like, I actually just need purchase order financing, right? So it's a little bit of an educational gap as well. I know I didn't exactly answer your question, but I hope it helps add color to it. Thank you.
Shall I?
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great answer. Hope you can hear me. If I can add, I think, and Max alluded to this earlier on as well, I think, so that valley of death is very much where Terratise sits as a company. So I didn't give you a very quick thumbnail sketch, because you did a much better job than I did about talking what you were doing. So Terratise sits in that middle for exactly the reason you're describing. So we try and basically take the large sums of money that exist in the financial institutions and funds that are looking for 10, 20, 30, $40 million investments, and we break that down into small pieces, and we put that into early stage nature-based investments across Indonesia and Southeast Asia. So, and again, as Matt said, I think it's not just the availability of the money, it's also pairing that money with expertise, pairing that money with expertise on nature, expertise on actually how you run a business, all the kind of pieces that you alluded to. And I think in terms of the failure rate, the theory of change is also very much that if you do that, then the failure rate radically drops. So it's not just about the injection of cash, because what often happens with small companies is that you will have an expertise gap, or they won't have a network to speak to who has the expertise that they need to deal with sourcing, or perhaps they, as you say, they don't need VC money, but that's all they can see. So VC money is the most visible because, of course, that's the stuff that gets all the headlines. But actually, what's required often is, say, working capital finance. It might be a very kind of a gentle loan of some variety. It might even be a mix. So the other thing that we do is we blend grant financing with investment cash. So we're able to do both of those things. And I don't think I said this on the presentation, but of the nature-based investments that are happening, the 7.5 billion that I talked about, largely which is going into nature tech, the vast majority of those, at least 50%, are in some way supported by blended finance. And that really means a combination of what you might call traditional investment money with grant money or money that's looking for a much smaller level of return. And so I guess, I'm not even sure we'd call it an innovation, but I guess that it's a bit of a lame innovation in my world. I guess the innovation, if it was such a thing, is that we're starting to see more investors look at that strategy as a more practical and feasible approach towards making these kinds of investments in nature. I guess the second innovation is that people like Max and I exist who are actually looking between the tracks and saying, okay, well, how do we bring in the missing piece here in order to bring that early stage venture to the point where they can get Series A funding or beyond. And that is, what's going to really reduce the failure rate in that valley of death. Just leaving it to sit and kind of, if you build it, they will come type model to investment, that's really going to kill a lot of these early stage, really quite interesting, exciting ideas.
And when we're talking about all the capital that we actually need to protect nature, restore, and build resilience for climate and adaptation, we see a lot of that coming. What was the question? The question is coming.
That's not just me.
No, it's not. So when we see a lot of that capital that is not yet here, but when it does come, we need people like you guys to be identifying these small ventures that are going through the Valley of Death and that actually would be able to access those funds quickly enough, right? But then how do we ensure that guys like you not only survive, but also proliferate around the market and are able to find all the different ventures that are needed in order to create the impact that we need? So essentially what I'm talking about is we don't have enough capital, but then one day if we end up having all of that capital, can we actually deploy it?
Yeah, I mean, I think to that point about we don't have enough capital, I think there's a kind of trope which is kicked around about not being enough money. There's not enough money in the system to really address that financing gap. And I think at its heart, and I don't know if you agree with this, at its heart, that's actually kind of not true. There's actually quite a lot of money. Money is not really the challenge. The challenge is that we haven't built the plumbing, the piping, the systems that connect the money to where the impact is. That's the big problem. And actually, the structures and systems of the financial institutions that exist already, their job's not to build the piping. So they're just like, well, we've got money, come to us with great projects that are 50 million and over, and we'll give you the money, which of course is absolutely accurate. The problem is there's not an architecture or an infrastructure or systems-based approach to dealing with that gap. And that, I think, is where people like Max and I come in, is to say, well, we've got to build up from the impact. There's no point looking down from the money. We've got to come up from the impact. And if we don't do that, we'll be sitting here in 20 years having exactly the same conversation. And we'll have picked off the 10, 20, 30 best nature tech investments, because they're the ones that can scale and attract VC money. All the rest will die. They'll die in the Valley of Death. So that's very much where, in my mind, the innovation comes in. And I guess the other innovation is you've got increasingly people like me who know about orangutans and forests and soil actually talking about investment. And what I'd like to see is more investment folks, like yourself, talking about orangutans, forests and soil. So we're meeting in the middle, and the boundaries between traditional NGO financing and grants and philanthropy, and the boundaries between impact investment and traditional financial instruments, they're all blurring and breaking down, and that's pretty cool.
Carol?
I love what you're saying now, Max, and I was just reflecting in your guys' presentation, just thinking that, I mean, to solve the situation that we are in, like, with these systems, aren't we using the same mindset that created these problems by actually having funds and investments and return of investment into the loop? So that's my kind of first reflection. And then when I think about really people that are really in the ground, when I think about, for example, in the agriculture sector, in the Amazon, for example, and I think the small farmers that are there in the ground, what they're trying to do, they are trapped in a situation where the financial system is giving to them all the resources by subsidies to plant soya and to keep doing what they're doing, but there is absolutely no system for the small farmers to change. And we know that these people that are really in the ground, living on these places, they are the ones that can make the change, you know, outside of offices and business and finance world, you know, they are there living that. So do you see, that's my question now, like, do you see a system that will actually empower people that are not even there to be a venture, you know? Like, when I think about the farmers there in the ground and you talk about venture, they're like, what does that even mean to them? You know, like, so how can we create a system for those people that are there to actually create the impact that they can create? Because we also know here in Indonesia that the farmers would love to change the system. They are not happy to be spraying pesticides and like being sick themselves by doing that if they had a different system, financial system. So I mean, just how do you do that outside of the mindset of investor? Because investor will always want return. And I feel I was a little bit trapped into that because we are using the same mindset to solve these problems, no?
Yeah, I mean, that's the world's largest question. Thanks for that. It's like 3 PhDs back to back. So, I mean, I think what you're asking me to do is kind of comment on the capitalist model. And yeah, but I totally agree with what you're saying. There's so many different ways I can answer this. So, I think the first thing to say is the biggest single thing that can be done for nature right now is regulation policy. In any country, anywhere in the world, but particularly Brazil, Indonesia, Central African countries, because that's where a lot of the impact is. So if you change the system, the regulatory and policy system around agricultural subsidies that directs people to use pesticides, or that make it cheaper for a farmer in Sabang Kaja to go and buy a kilo of pesticide that will destroy his soil in 5 years, than it is to buy a kilo of organic pesticide that will actually regenerate his soil. Unless you address that problem, all of the stuff that we're talking about by itself won't help. So like, absolutely correct. Like you can't have one without the other. And I mentioned agricultural subsidies as the single biggest driver of some of the challenges. So that's totally true. And I think that to some degree will go towards, it goes a little bit to what you were saying about NGOs. I think what I'm saying is philanthropy plays a role in all sorts of interesting ways. And the position I sit in isn't to denigrate or remove the role of traditional philanthropy. That remains incredibly important to try and tackle some of those problems. I think the slice of the problem that I'm looking at is very small. And really, I hope in 20 years' time, the kind of companies like Teratai won't be needed because the plumbing will exist and it will flow. And there will be structures and systems in place that will be picked up by the Indonesian government, which will mean that my job is essentially defunct. And that was very much the approach I had in an NGO. How do I work myself out of a job? And I feel very much like Teratai should work itself out of its relevancy in the countries it's in. So I know that's a poor answer, but regulatory policy systems play a key role. Philanthropy has a lot more to do than just help impact investments make more money. Totally agree with that. And yeah, there's a big world beyond the venture, which I think we need to think about. I guess what I would say is what's most exciting right now, perhaps even when I started in 1998 and I was in Borneo doing that work, there was no ability then when the guy that I was buying rice from in the village, there was no ability for that guy to sell his rice to Europe. There was no ability for that rice to be traced beyond the plane that it went onto every Monday morning. The difference now, I think, is that we have the opportunity to have those systems have an impact in those places in a way that we never did before. So that if you're a farmer in Sabang Country, you can sell your products on a global market. very hard, lots of barriers, but it is actually increasingly possible to make that happen. And in that context, we don't necessarily need the big ventures, the big companies who are looking for impact investment. What I hope we're doing is increasingly breaking down the barriers that allow farmers like that to have an audience and a footprint beyond the farm that they're on.
Great. Thank you. Massi, you want to give it a go? No? Okay.
Well said.
Next question here.
Oh, I've got the other microphone, so I think
Okay.
there's Alex, but I'm going to ask a question as another woman in the audience, because one thing that that Massi did speak about was the gender gap, and what we find is women's participation, not only in the venture building and in creating new startups, but also being a critical part of this system and how we create a new system that is going to serve all of us. So I would love for you guys to speak about what you think needs to happen and how quickly we can start to evolve this system to ensure that women, that minorities, that smallholder farmers are actually helping us build these systems, not just the recipients of these systems. And what can we be doing on the ground here in Indonesia to make that happen and make that happen more quickly?
Yeah, obviously a very multifaceted, complex topic, and I recognize the irony of the fact that we're three dudes sitting here. But I think the first starting point is always with awareness, right? And when I was coming out of graduate school and joining Catalyst Fund, the first thing that I noticed about that fund that was unlike any other funds that I had encountered before was the leadership team was pretty much all female, and that was done very intentionally. The actual original two co-founders were two guys, and they recognized the role that it was kind of like this, self-awareness issue where they were like, look, we're two co-founders, we're operating in these developing countries, most of our beneficiaries are actually women, we should elevate female leadership. So the CEO, managing director, both women, head of impact, woman. So that started from actually the structural perspective of the fund. And then when we were actually making decisions with who we were going to fund, we made a very clear and very upfront when we were looking at different ventures. Look, do they have a female co-founder? Do they not have a female co-founder? If they do not, we're deprioritizing them because we want to make sure that with our scarce capital, we want to be catalytic and we want to make sure that we're moving the needle, being additional with our funding, right? So it started, I guess to answer your question in two parts, is it started with the self-awareness with more of a structural change, but then also from a process perspective, we were being intentional about putting that structure, basically putting where our money, where our mouths are. That's an example from Catalyst Fund, and similarly what we're doing at Moonshot is also quite similar as well. Yeah. Matt?
Yes, I think the criteria around how you make investments is critical. But I think the other thing I would say is women run, in the nature space in particular, women run businesses have better impact. So, and that's just science. It's just a fact. So, if you're trying to have an impact at a community level in the nature, biodiversity, climate space, and you're excluding 50% of the population, then it makes it a bad investment. So, there needs to be more appreciation of that. What else was I going to say? I think a lot of the problem also is there's a real lack of visibility, and a lot of that comes from because there's these hurdles, time, scale. There's a lot of downward pressure on the supply chain of these companies being developed. And to me, the systems piece of this is if you can unlock some of those, then more women entrepreneurs, more women started businesses will start to emerge, and then there'll be a kind of a virtuous cycle. So I think the more kind of companies like Moonshot and Territory that exist, the better that will be. I think.
Just to comment on what Matt was saying, I think if the world were officially run by women, we wouldn't be where we are today. Probably we wouldn't be speaking here today.
We would kill all the men.
That model doesn't work that well.
That would bring us another kind of extension. Yeah. So we've got Mike here, and then Alex in the back. So, yeah. No.
Here?
Carol. Yeah. No, he's queued up.
And then this lovely lady off.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm Lalit. I've been in social and impact, both environmental and social impact space last 10 years especially. I've been following Teratai closely, Max, and got to know Max also today. The one question I have is for both specific, your organization Teratai and your organization Max, top three, what are your top three challenges? Because I heard a lot of global challenges, macro, micro. I would love to know what are your top three challenges which you are facing right, and what is your need currently? That would be love to know.
I love this question. It's a great question. We should meet. Okay, so I mean, this is where I get in trouble. So I'm trying to sort of like turn on my filter. And failing. So one of the top challenges for me is that we, as I mentioned, we blend finance. We try and raise grants and we try and raise impact investment. A lot of my filter's so broken. A lot of the impact investors we speak to, frankly, are kind of full of shit. So there's a lot of people who talk about impact, but what they really mean is we want projects, investments, ventures that can make us a lot of money, and we quite like some stuff to be nice that we can talk about externally. That's what they really mean. So one of the biggest challenges that I have in trying to raise money into the ventures that we support is that when I go to an impact investment, say I've got this incredible project, and for example, an investment we've just closed in Kalimantan, which I can bore you about later, but it's a beautiful project, beautiful company, great potential for scale. It doesn't produce enough money fast enough for most impact investors, bottom line. Can it make money? Yes. Will it have incredible impact? Yes. When I go to impact investors, do they say yes? No. So there's a problem, there's a mismatch. And the mismatch often is in the minds and the heads of the people who call themselves impact investors. So number one problem, impact investors need to kind of, at a very baseline, be less greedy. There is money to be made, there are things to be done, but you cannot call yourself an impact investor if you're not prepared to actually get your hands dirty and get involved in changing the system that we're talking about changing. And that means sometimes not taking a 20% return, it means taking a 10% return. And it means taking it over 5 years and not over 3 years. If you can't do that, then frankly, I'm not interested in talking to you as an impact investor. So that's the number one problem. It's my filter's completely gone now. Yeah. Number two problem is philanthropy needs to step up and look at its role as a de-risking tool, not just as we just want to support women and build schools. Because that 50-year-old attitude is actually part of the problem that's driving a lot of the problems in these places where impact's required. So philanthropy needs to get off its ass and actually do some thinking about how it can operate, and have some conversations with people like Max and say, well, okay, look, if I put $100,000 into this latest thing that you've got, and if I get a 2% return, that's 2% much better than what I previously would have got by just sticking it into painting a school in some village in rural Indonesia. So we need to get real about what the role of philanthropy is and how it can have genuine change on the ground. Because I think it's super exciting. What do I need in terms of Teratai? I need more people who are having this conversation, frankly, who have dropped the organizational flag waving nonsense and are actually saying, okay, how can we do the work that needs to be done? We know how to have impact. We know where the companies are. There is not a shortage of pipeline. We know how to get this stuff done. We know the gaps. We understand how to solve these problems. What we don't yet have is enough people who are standing behind us saying, how can we help?
Well, that's a tough act to follow. But I'm going to lazily say copy and paste to that. But then I'll also add on to that. This is actually something that I experienced in my previous role at Catalyst Fund that I found quite interesting, and I didn't really expect it because when I was studying development economics in school, I was there was a rosy picture that was painted of the development finance institutions, the DFIs, so to speak, the World Banks of the world, the ADBs of the world. You're laughing because you know where I'm going with this. Catalyst Fund actually started off. The main anchor LP was actually 4 and 8, basically a DFI from a European country, and that DFI actually gave very patient capital to us. But then after a certain point, they started to get very hands-on and a little bit micromanagey with the way that we were running our things, and so there felt like there was this weird power dynamic, almost like a lack of trust. So the funds themselves, right? Keep in mind, we also have investors behind the funds, And the power dynamic between the LPs, the investors of those funds, and the actual managers of the fund that they're deploying capital, that matters a lot too. And that can be like a tough relationship to manage. Just something to keep in mind as we talk about this big climate finance gap. There's multiple people who are funding multiple things, and then Matt and I are sitting kind of in the middle as the managers of funds. But there's people behind the funds as well that also have their own opinions about how the money should be managed, etc. So that power dynamic can be quite sensitive. So I guess that would be the fourth point to add to Matt's.
That's a great point. Yeah, DFIs. And a micro story to share also. So this latest investment that Teratai has just completed with a company called Fireside. Look them up; they're brilliant. I called my mum, as you do when you do good things. I called my mum and said, "Hey, mum, guess what I've just done? This is really great." And she's like, "Oh, that's great. Yeah, tell me about it." So I told her, gave her the story. I said, "It's brilliant. They're sourcing this Elipe nut that falls from rainforest trees, and they're converting it into this oil, this butter, which is like cocoa butter, but it's incredible, high quality, goes into food, goes into cosmetics, and they wash it in rainforest rivers, and they carry it out, and they ship it all around the world. And it's just great, I've just come back, I'm full of it." And she's like, "I give 600 euros a year to a charity. What could they do with 600 euros? So I called up the CEO, Forrest White, and said, "Do you want 600 euros for my mum?" Because they were harvesting at that time, they were collecting these nuts from the forest. And he's like, "Yeah, I'll take 600 euros. My mum got the 600 euros back in 3 months. She got, from me on a WhatsApp, she got a report about where that money had gone. She could see the villages where the money had been spent. She knew that, there was an impact embedded in everything she'd done." I mean, this is my mum. My impact report was pretty limited. But that kind of idea of like transitioning from what she previously was given away every month, $12.99 a month because she feels bad, and she wants to do something that she can, stick her money somewhere. She got it back in 3 months, and now she's doing it again. So I converted my mum into like a kind of quasi-working capital fund.
You basically reinvented Kiva.
Yeah, exactly. So she's now talking. I feel that's a bit of a pyramid scheme as well, because she's now talking to her friends, going, "Have you got 500 euros? Do you want to spend on this amazing thing my son's doing?" So like that, it sounds small, but actually, that kind of thing can have really quite seismic impacts. So yeah, think about where you put your money in. It can have some pretty powerful impacts, even at a small scale.
Yeah, and this is the beauty of conversations like this, right? Because we want you guys to take this conversation somewhere to your home countries, or if you live here, you're from here, to your families, to your friends, because that's the power of these kind of conversations, right? It's a ripple effect. We can just get the money to where it actually needs to be. And Matt was giving another example during his talk about the Norwegian fund, right? That just changed their investment strategy because they got 400 people knocking on their doors and asking, "Where's my money going into?" And it always starts with conversations like this. So go home, go to your families, go to your friends, and continue this kind of conversation. Super, super important. Alex?
Hi guys, I'm Alex from Accelerating Asia. We I think we're kind of the kind of impact investors that you don't like. We invest in things like electric motorcycles and we invest in things like electric motorcycle, last mile delivery, and these kind of things that they try and grow. And I think that last example, Matt, that you gave, where your mom is really making an impact and she's getting her return really fast, I think that's the kind of story that, actually I wanted to ask that question, was like, what kind of stories do you have that tell us about the impact and the returns on the investments that you're making and how fast they come back? And because I believe capital is greedy, and when I talk to investors, they're greedy. They're always going to be greedy. And so what we have to do is we have to feed their greed with things that are going to make a positive impact. And also that money that goes in, it's going to die if it doesn't have a way to grow. So we're looking to make the biggest impact that we can. I know you guys are as well. And the biggest impact that we can have is giving it to companies that are going to grow that money so that they can, make more sales, so that they can grow their businesses, so they can make more sales, and they can grow their impact. So I wanted to ask you guys, can you give us some more examples of how these investors are getting them, how these companies are growing and how these investments are growing, and how and more of that sales pitch side, that so we can hear that. Thank you.
Yeah, it's a great question from a fellow investor. Thank you for that. I'll give a couple of examples actually. So I showed very briefly on the first slide that I used to work at an organization called Kiva, which I just mentioned to Matt earlier. There I actually launched a portfolio. So just to give some context, Kiva.org is a peer-to-peer microfinance platform that allows users from all over the world, lenders from all over the world, to make small loans to people all over the world. Usually it's like, you know, a classic example would be somebody in the US is making a $25 or $50 loan, not 600 euros, even smaller, to, you know, a smallholder farmer in Mexico who needs to buy a productive asset so that they can increase their yield, right? So when I was at Kiva, we actually were trying to show, can we do, instead of the average loan size at the time was about $500, can we actually do $50,000, right? So 100xing what we could do. And we actually tested that model with, I don't know if anybody in the audience is wearing recycled sandals, Indosoles, anybody? Okay, so that was actually one of our experimental loans. We did a $5,000 loan with Indosole, then $10,000, then $50,000. And they all repaid within 6 months. And they just kept sort of climbing that credit ladder, if you will, which is a classic product design that you do in a microfinance situation, right? So we kind of proved out that we could actually do these larger amounts, even though people were still lending as a crowd in increments of only $25 or $50. Instead of requiring 10 people or 50 people to do it, we needed like 2,000 people to actually fund the loan. But there was actually still appetite to do that, and that program is still running. That portfolio is still alive.
And those people are getting above market or at market.
It's a 0% interest rate.
Oh, 0% interest rate.
Yeah. So the way that Kiva sort of markets itself is like it's a more effective grant, basically, right? It's a grant that repays itself and can perpetuate. So similar to what Matt was describing with his mom, that's sort of what we did. Sorry, did you want to jump in? Okay, saw you wagging the mic, so I wasn't sure. The other example that I would give is actually from Catalyst Fund. So the case there, what I was showing with Farm to Feed. Again, when we met them, they were literally just a food rescue NGO. They didn't even have like a commercial model or anything. And through a 9-month program with us, basically we helped venture build them to become a commercially viable venture backable model. And they've been able to raise a $1 million round just I think 2 or 3 months ago with big folks actually backing it, like GSMA, Mercy Corps Ventures, and folks like that. So I know that technically that investment has not returned or actually materialized in a actually return back to the fund, but we can actually look at the implied valuation of that company, and it's basically increased by some multiple, like 3x since we raised that round. So signs are in the right direction, but of course these things do take time. Could be like a 5-year return or even a 7-year return. Right? It depends on how you actually structure the fund.
Your fund has a 10-year life?
In that case, with Catalyst Fund, it was a 10. Yeah.
Just a short addition, but so the working capital that we give out, we realized pretty early on that there was a working capital need in Indonesia, a pretty heavy one. So we were fortunate enough to start the working capital fund in November last year, and we deployed within 6 weeks our first investment. Our investments are typically at 9% return. They're non-collateralized, so they're relatively competitive for the market. But the 9% return that we get goes back into the fund, so it's a revolving fund. And we're able to do that because of our blended finance approach to that facility. Just to give a bit more detail on how that works. And typically our investment kind of criteria is that we're looking for companies that will scale 3x, essentially. And that obviously is it's fairly conservative, within the market. And I think to your point about you're the kind of investor I hate, it's not true. It's not true. I think one of the things that's really interesting for me with, I guess, perhaps some of the things that you're already investing in, I would look at your portfolio with a very different set of eyes. And I'd be thinking, okay, for example, with the electric engines, for example, we were having some really interesting conversations about the application of that in the marine space at the moment, which I think is incredibly powerful and interesting. It's both a data collection tool and also a driver of emissions reductions and also a revenue piece. So, say that again?
Total cost of ownership for the fisherman or for the fleet is lower.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So there's some super interesting, what you might call sort of traditional investments that actually have a very, very strong nature narrative. It's just often what traditional investors don't look at that nature narrative as a way of generating additional commercial revenues.
Just yeah, I'm just not speaking loud, so it's all good. A different question. So tapping a little bit into this specific mandate, can nature pay, basically? And some of the things that I'm seeing in Europe at the moment is a conversation starting around seeing nature as an asset class, as a fiduciary asset class. And I wonder if this is something that you see could also transition to Asia. And if so, do you see that helping with this closing the financing gap?
I think it's a better one for you.
Okay. Okay, all the good questions. I mean, caveat everything I'm about to say with what I said earlier is that I'm not an investor. I don't have a financial background, so what I'm about to say may not make sense. But I think a lot of, for me, the kind of relabeling as nature as an asset class in itself is not actually super productive. If it helps the financial markets understand what we're talking about better as a narrative tool, then I'm all for it. I think there are pieces within there that are interesting to unpack. So, for example, we've had a very carbon-focused approach towards nature, and as I said earlier, you can invest in carbon and have zero impact on nature. I'd like to see, and we are seeing, I guess, and this is where it's interesting to your point about nature becoming an asset class, is how do we quantify and talk about the benefits that are much wider than carbon? What kind of ecosystem services can we capture and discuss in a meaningful, sensible way? You may have already seen a lot of work on biodiversity credits, or biodiversity offsets even, depending on how controversial you want to be, as one piece of that, which then leads us to say, well, how do we measure what's happening with biodiversity in the landscape where we're operating? And that has a whole other deep conversation. As well as biodiversity, there's air, your friend, with the AQI sensors. Water services are a big one elsewhere in the world, Latin America particularly, not really being operationalized in Indonesia. Had some interesting arguments with Aquadana about that. So yeah, I mean, as an asset class, I mean, I guess I get hung up on the terminology a little bit. And also there's a part of me that intrinsically, this is perhaps the sort of the nature-loving part of me, is a bit horrified by that as a term. God, do we really want to is it really a bloody asset class? Are we just really, or what we're trying to do is we're trying to capture what needs to happen in a way that commercial markets understand? Yeah, I don't know. I have a little bit of an allergic response to some of the terminology. Go on, carry on.
Can I just, I'll try to speak louder, pitch back to that a little bit, because a little bit what you said as well is that right now, the money comes in from extraction, right? You have no incentive basically to keep the health, your land healthy. But if you have an asset class, you want to maintain it. You want to make sure that this can keep on producing. So that's why I think, yeah, putting a value in nature and so on, but maybe that has a benefit in taking it from extraction to health, to restorative approaches.
Yeah, let me jump in. So I think, one of the first things that you learn when you take an environmental economics class is that there are externalities with any activity that a human being does, right? And the issue is that these externalities are not being internalized to the cost or the price of that good or service that's being provided. And again, to use some of the points that Matt brought up earlier, is it's actually the role of the regulators to come and step in and make sure that all those externalities are actually being accounted for. So to give an example, in Jakarta, one of the worst environmental issues there is air pollution. And well, that's basically a failure of the regulator to properly price in the externalities that are being caused by coal-fired power plants, by internal combustion engines, by trash burning, etc. Right? And that's why that problem persists, because the regulator isn't stepping in and doing the right thing. In fact, just to give a crazy story, last August, Jakarta was topping the charts of the worst polluted city in the world when it comes to air pollution. And the government, instead of trying to solve the problem at the root cause by solving the problem at the actual root cause, was actually trying to solve the symptoms. So they were, and it was doing it in a nonsensical way. They were like spraying water into the air, hoping that that would, you know, disperse the air particles and make it cleaner to breathe. It was complete rubbish. Sorry, no filter again. But again, it comes back to like the regulator playing that strong role. And unfortunately, you know, when it comes to, you know, looking at some of the parts of the world that actually have the most biodiversity, the Amazon, the Congo, Indonesia, there's really a mixed record of the regulators playing the right role of being the regulator and pricing in those externalities.
Quick question to you guys. We have a couple of entrepreneurs and startups here in the audience as well. What would be your tip for them to help them get faster access to capital? So we talked about capital being available, and you guys are sort of creating the plumbing and being there to enable that capital to reach them. What do they need to do to access that faster? What are you guys looking for? Would there be top 3 things that you're always looking for in the investments that you're making? Thank you.
Okay. I mean, I guess the short answer is it depends, but in terms of, I mean, what we're looking for fundamentally is businesses that have the potential for systemic impact. And what we mean by that is, you know, if you look at your typical kind of, what you might say, sort of your boutique nature-focused company, you know, beekeeping operation in one village in central Sumatra. Beautiful story, great impact on that level. Very little ability to scale beyond that jurisdiction or beyond that village even. So we're looking at problems that can be solved across all beekeepers, if you like, across all of Indonesia. So how does that project, venture, innovation have capacity to scale? I think in terms of the entrepreneurs or companies that are out there, you know, there were 2 parts to your question. Really. One was like how do they access the finance, right? So for me, it's like think about your systemic impact. That's one of the things that I look at a lot. Not only because, you know, that means that you have a scalable model that can therefore attract more investment, but also because, you know, from an impact perspective, it's a bigger bang for our buck. I think that's one. I think one of the big failings, too strong a word. I think one of the big gaps that I see with a lot of companies that I think are out there looking for investment at the moment, particularly the kind of nature impact space, is they don't tell a good enough story. I think there's a real absence of good storytelling. And some of that comes back to data. Do you know the impact of your business, or are you just saying, we think we do good things? But can you actually quantify that in some meaningful way? Is that the livelihoods of the people you're working with? Is it women you're engaging with? Have you got data on how those, you know, how your model has improved against certain metrics? Some of that's data, but some of it really is storytelling. And if you're like, people like me often are pretty hopeless at storytelling. So, you know, the conservation NGO world has survived despite its terrible storytelling for a very long time. So they'll go into the Ministry of Finance office in Papua New Guinea or in Peru, and they'll tell a story about frogs and conservation and soil biodiversity. And the Minister of Finance sits there and goes, I have no idea what you're talking about, and it makes no difference to the operations of my office. If you're Max, and you go into that office and you talk about livelihoods, voters, job creation, return on investment, rural development, road building, and rural power infrastructure, then every single minister, I guarantee, every single Minister of Finance around the world will be like, oh, that's incredible. Like, yeah, we should absolutely do this. And you sneak in nature and biodiversity through the back door. You hold the impact, but you tell the story to the Minister of Finance about the finance. And conservation, impact-minded folks like myself have done a pretty poor job at really understanding who their audience is to tell good stories. And I think often impact-driven businesses, they start because people really care about a particular issue and they're really passionate, and all they can see is that issue, but they often don't then craft that story to meet the needs of the investors or the people who have the money. Don't know if you'd agree with that.
Yeah, totally agree with that. And the other thing that I would add on to that is kind of hard to put into words, but basically the coachability of the founder, right? So in the example that I gave before with Farm to Feed, they're started as a food rescue NGO, but they were open to feedback and taking into account the needs of the investors. Basically, they wanted to make sure that they could actually scale their impact, but they know they had to play the game, right? And they knew that they were lacking in certain areas, and they were open to feedback. That's why the venture building team from Catalyst Fund came in and helped them to actually scale that up. And I think that's something that we're also looking at with Moonshot, because we're also going to be fairly hands-on as an investor. We want to make sure that any founder that we're talking to, can we actually see ourselves hanging out with them for 8 hours in the course of a day, and they're actually going to be receptive and also be easy to work with, right? Because that also matters a lot. You get a lot of these these Silicon Valley Elon Musk types that are uncoachable founders, right? Of course, Elon Musk, maybe he's an exception and he didn't need to be coached, or maybe he does, I don't know, depending on where you sit. Those types of founders that have a very strong personality and are a bit arrogant when they're building their business, that can come across as somebody who's not coachable, and thus it becomes hard for an investor like a Moonshot Ventures, like a Teratai, to actually work with them.
Can I You mentioned Jakarta. That really thickens the plot, I think. Of course, we're all aware of the fact that there's a new capital being built on Borneo, on the Kalimantan side. And one of the underlying arguments is that we're going to solve Jakarta by moving, 3, it's now 10 million people to the new capital. We are involved in this new capital as Mars Architects, and we have received this really bizarre brief, and I want to ask you both one question. On a positive note, the people we're dealing with are mostly women in managerial capacity, so that's really great. But the situation is bizarre. The red dots that you showed, Matt, are of course now widespread, and the new capital is not being built in a primordial forest, but is in one of those very large red zones, production forest, acacia and palm. So when I saw that, I just came back. In a way, there was a silver lining, because we're not forced to demolish, and the core of that city is already built. But now the new mission is to, for 2045, create a forest, quote-unquote, city, meaning that 60% of that city has to be jungle, biodiverse jungle. And I see you slightly grinning already. So the first question is for you. Do you think conceptually it's possible to have this weird hybrid of the jungle and the city? Personally, I don't think that's, as an urbanist, I don't think it makes any sense. But let's play along, because we have to. And then the second question is for you, Max. What would be the investment structure to make that happen on these long tracks, these long cycles towards 2045?
Okay. All the good questions. Biodiversity, if we just put aside the word biodiversity, because you can't have a biodiverse city in the true meaning of an ecosystem, you can manage the green areas or the natural areas within an urban environment for specific outcomes. I think that's probably a better way of putting it. So, for Singapore is an interesting example. Pangolins are, the world's most traded species, and Singapore has an incredibly high population of pangolins thriving in their urban forest areas. So you need to kind of pick the bits that you want to manage for. But can you have biodiversity? Can you have species operating well within cities? Anyone that's lived in London for any time knows that foxes are a huge problem, and you see them sitting on tube stations in the morning waiting to get on trains. It's there's no problem with having animals in cities. Animals are very well adapted to live in those kinds of environments. Can it be fully, truly biodiverse? It's a different question, really. I guess the bigger question is, will people live with that? Because human behaviour is also another element to this. Some parts of the world that are not Singapore, people would be eating the pangolins. I imagine in Indonesia there may be some challenges with elements around how biodiversity is interacted with community. Most people don't see rats as biodiversity, for example, but they can be very very good in some contexts. So it kind of depends what you manage for. Can you have a very green city with lots of green space and lots of use of natural infrastructure to make it cooler and to kind of manage water flows? Absolutely, and you should do that, not only because it's sensible and looks better, but also because people are more likely to live there, property values go up, all that sort of stuff. Biodiversity, yeah, tricky. I'm trying to imagine. Anyway, there's a whole other issue, but I'll stop. Go on.
In terms of how to finance this, well, we actually wrote an issue on project finance, which is one of the biggest components of solving climate finance gap. Project finance basically just entails bringing financing to a particular project. It's basically a finite asset that you can finance. It can be anything from financing a piece of machinery for a factory, financing a plot of land. And project finance plays a big role in basically the type of work that you're doing in Borneo. But also, something that I think it's a bit underrated, and I'm going to bring China into the conversation for a bit. If you look at the green and sustainability bond market, China pretty much dominates that market, and Southeast Asia really hasn't tapped into that pool of financing. And that could actually be a role to play for basically financing some of the assets that you're doing in this new city in Borneo as well. Of course, when it comes to these more innovative green financing mechanisms, the question always comes up, how are you actually ensuring that is a quality financial product, and how are you actually monitoring and validating that it's actually having that purported impact, right? So again, coming back to what Matt brought up, how do you actually quantify some of these seemingly unquantifiable things, and dressing them up in the language of financial markets to actually solve some of those. So yeah, I would probably answer that in two ways: project finance and green sustainability bonds.
And just another comment on this. I'm originally from Brazil, and Brazil and Indonesia are very similar in many ways, and one of them is the lack of legislation and law enforcement. Brazil had its capital moved from Rio de Janeiro to Brasilia in the 60s, and we know what happened to nature after that, right? So we take maps, screenshots of satellite data, and that's essentially what happened to that part of Brazil. And when I heard for the first time about Indonesia's capital moving to Kalimantan, Borneo, I felt a very similar way to what happened to Brazil, and I don't have very high hopes for that matter. Sorry to be grim.
The city also doesn't work, right? Brasilia, as a concept city, is quite a failure. Would you agree?
It's a boring city, right? Everywhere you go, it looks the same, exactly the same.
Doesn't have soul.
It doesn't have soul. It's very weird.
But it works.
Yeah.
It works, yeah.
Yeah. Well, there's about 3 million people living there. Sustainably, absolutely no. So I think it was very detrimental to nature in that part of the country. That's what I wanted to say.
Or to use another example that's a bit closer to home, Myanmar actually moved the capital from Yangon to Naypyidaw. And I don't know what the record looks like from a nature perspective, but at least from a livability of a city perspective, I think it's pretty much failed, because I think the population of that city, despite being roughly the same size as Yangon, there's nobody that's actually living there. And there's these videos you can look on YouTube of just Naypyidaw looking like a ghost town. All right, so all that money invested in building this pretty impressive looking city with lots of structures and lots of statues and whatnot, but basically nobody lives there.
Hi, my name is Shahzad. I'm from Karachi, Pakistan. I grow Miyawaki forests in the city for the last 7-8 years. Our two cities are pretty much tops the list of bad air quality in the world. So Jakarta loses out there. I get very conflicted. So I've been trying to grow urban forests out of the cities in Pakistan using that methodology, and it's been very successful experiment there. I get very conflicted about finding how to finance all of that activity. Want to learn more about obviously the impact financing and so on and so forth. But then the things that I study about Earth's ecological resources being overused already, and the capacity to regenerate the ecological resources of the planet. When we talk about impact investment and stuff, and we want to make money back out of all of those investments and faster and sooner, and the percentages of that being 15 and 20% or whatever percentage. So just need your views on the fact that our expectations out of those investments and the system that we have already built, which have already gotten us into this mess, is going to somehow fix this whole problem as well? Do you guys think that's a possibility? Because we're already in an overshoot of ecological resources, and as I study, and I don't know, I may be wrong there, but it's if we're already using twice the Earth's capacity of regeneration. So if we want to continue to make more money out of whatever investments we want to do, we are in deficit and we continue to go into deficit further. Just your thoughts on your financial side of how do you guys see it?
So just to be super clear here, I think Matt mentioned earlier as well that Matt and I are playing in a pretty narrow slice of the financial markets overall. You saw that chart that gave the figure, I think it was like $4 trillion climate finance gap. I think private markets definitely have a role to play there, but even if you saw the slide that I showed right after that, there's only about like $200 billion worth of climate finance globally that's being counted towards that $4+ trillion gap, and it's growing year on year, right? So that's actually a pretty small slice of the equation. Really, what also needs to happen, and coming back to what I mentioned to this lady over here, the public finance space also matters tremendously, right? Not just from a regulator perspective, but also from like an actual financing mechanism, right? So I think that gap, it's not just going to be solved with private markets, and even a narrow slice of the private markets, which is like basically impact investors and venture capital funds. But really, it's going to take like all these different types of financiers to solve that gap. You asked two-part question. What was the first part? Sorry, remind me again.
Expecting continuous growth out of whatever we're investing into already, and the concept of degrowth actually simultaneously the two things that are being discussed out there. So how do you guys is there not an inherent conflict in what we're trying to do with impact investment here? If you want to continue to grow the same thing, will you tell that?
A very philosophical question about the nature of capitalism and impact investing. I don't even know how to answer that. Do you want to take a stab at that, Matt?
I mean, I mean, degrowth is a fascinating idea, and I'm super into. I guess the first thing I'd say is that I think it's possible to have the flywheel move in the other direction. So I think there's a lot of investment that's currently happening that is negative, that could be, if not positive, then at least neutral. And I use the word neutral very loosely because I think everything has an impact. But I think it is possible. For example, food and agriculture. We're all inherently part of the food and agriculture system. We know it's possible to grow food in a much, much better way than we currently grow it. We can grow the food we need to feed another 6 billion people on the land we currently use for food. We don't. We do a terrible job of that. So is it possible to change that system in a way which has fewer inputs, less costs, better for humans, better for nature? Absolutely. So I think it's partly about spinning the flywheel the other direction. It's not necessarily, I don't think you necessarily you need to go all the way to the degrowth argument to say, that's our only kind of exit. But in some senses, I think it's possible, as I said before, it's possible to make a return from doing good things as opposed to not doing good things at a very simple level. And I think what at least I am trying to explore, cajole, force, push, terrify people into doing is to, for your example, the Milwaukee Forest, and Max's example of his mates who developed the kind of AQI census for pollution. Well, why can't we have a regulatory system that forces people or forces municipal authorities to pay for the benefit that your Milwaukee forests are generating, which creates a revenue stream? You're still generating a profit out of that, but that doesn't mean it's that's not a negative outcome for either the economy or for the local place where your forests are. So I think there are ways and works around which I think can be really, really impactful. And I think we're really only at the very beginning of this kind of inventive conversation.
Thank you. Guys, we have time for 2 more questions, and then we're going to the networking session, and that's it for today. So we've got the mic over there in the back, and then Haley, you've been asking for a while. I'll get the mic to you as well. Well, we will have time after this official Q&A session. We will have time to mingle around and ask those questions, so no worries, yeah?
Hi everyone, I'm Sandy. I'm an early stage startup founder, and we're on a mission to solve textile waste of hotels in a scalable solution that creates circular system and focusing on water footprint. So thank you for the talk. There's 2 things that struck me. Max, you mentioned about the valley of death, which is me as a first-time entrepreneur, this is new to me. And also, Matt, you mentioned about the nature-based solution. So the three big things: protect, manage, and restore. I guess my question is more about how does this apply to startups, specifically founders? How to protect solution-focused and impact-led startups, especially the founders, from reaching the valley of death, and motivating them, especially when at the start, access to resources, support are not actually available, or we don't even know. And I guess for you, if you guys had an opportunity, is there a system we can change or wish to initiate to support these, to actually nurture and create more system impact towards change makers? Or perhaps there's already something existing that we can tap into that I'm not aware of.
So the cause of death for a lot of early stage startups can be, lots of different root causes. A helpful framework to look at different startups to sort of, piece together what exactly is happening is to look at each individual component of, what's basically driving that startup, right? So what does the team look like? What does the product look like? What stage of product is it at? How big is the market? Is it growing? What are the financing needs of that startup? Is it just a pure equity play? Is it revenue-based financing, working capital, etc.? What does the regulatory environment look like, right? When you start to look at each of those components, then it starts to be a bit clear, like what is going to eventually drive a startup to actually crossing the chasm of death or valley of death, versus actually going and plunging deeper into it. So I would urge any founders in the room to actually go through that mental exercise, because those are the exact type of questions that investors like myself and Matt are asking when we're considering putting money into a startup. And then the second question, remind me again, sorry, Sandy.
In terms of if there's any systems or support that's already existing aside from just financing, like the VC side, right?
Yeah, I mean there are existing accelerators and incubators in Southeast Asia and Indonesia. A lot of them focused out of Singapore, particularly some of the good ones. Happy to help connect. If you haven't got those connections already, happy to help do that. I think the challenge with a lot of those is they're very short term, and they tend to have a very sort of VC mindset. So like the things that come out of them that do well are the things that people can make money on quick. So, which is kind of why Territory exists. So yeah, maybe let's chat and we can help connect you with some people.
And there is the Scale Climate Action Meetup, right? Where we're actually trying to support the business ecosystem to create scale, right, on climate solutions. So becoming part of this conversation is super important. Coming to the events is super important. You meet people like Massi and Matt, and so many others, so much bright people that can help you. So that's the goal. That's why we do what we do. So please keep coming and interact with the crowd afterwards. That's super important. And I want to add that the team, as Massi was saying, the team is super important in a startup, right? Of course, the founders are incredibly important, but the team of people that you're bringing in to work with you, including investors, is extremely important. And this part of events is where you actually meet a lot of these people, right? You want to make sure that the investors you're bringing into your business are like-minded and are actually working with you towards a common goal, right? And not just to make profits and quick profits. So it's very, very important that you look at the team more holistically rather than just your own team, but also who is your support team, investors, advisors, and etc. to help you thrive in this business, especially if you're a first-time founder, as you were mentioning, right? Yeah.
There's also a women's subgroup of skill
Cool. I was just actually on that point. Who in the audience is an entrepreneur, founder, looking for support, interested in investments? Okay. And then who in the audience is an investor, accelerator, incubator, kind of interested in supporting? Okay. So just, because I wanted to kind of flag that I know Peter, for example, is a great resource on this. I'm sitting at the back there. But if there are others in the room that, just connect, because this is kind of the important part. And yeah, definitely reach out to others to try and build that network. Yeah.
Thanks, Mark. We have one more question there, and then we break out, yeah?
Thank you very much. I'm Sheldon. I run a EV business, but my question is totally separate. It's more to do with the bridging of the funding gap. have you looked into or explored the possibility of Islamic capital? The primary reason is, if you look at Islamic capital, the spirit of Islamic financing is entrepreneurship, community benefits, social benefits. Because of that, the returns are largely profit-driven. And then because of that, you have a longer sort of loan maturity and sort of patient capital, if you like. And then lastly, one most obvious one is Southeast Asia is the largest populated Muslim. So there is liquidity, and there is an established regulatory framework. So how do you see Islamic funding coming into bridging that funding gap at this moment?
I mean, just answer from my perspective so far, the short answer is yes. We think Islamic finance can be particularly impactful around working capital and relatively quick recycling of working capital. In fact, we're looking to a couple of Islamic banks around this idea of providing guarantees. So looking at loan guarantees as a mechanism which they are actually quite interested in. But yeah, broadly speaking, we've actually had some really positive feedback and conversations with the Islamic financing industry generally. I think it's very aligned with a lot of our work. Yeah.
Yeah. Wearing my current Moonshot hat, we haven't actually looked at it in depth, but actually in my past life when I was with Kiva, most of our partners on the ground in Indonesia in particular, but also in South Asia, were actually Islamic microfinance institutions. And the reason that the Kiva model worked so well for them is because we were doing 0% interest loans. And of course, there's an issue with interest in Islamic finance and Sharia finance. So we worked very closely with a lot of those types of partners, and they were great funding partners. But actually, since you brought up this question, now I'm curious, marrying that idea with the portfolio that I launched at Kiva, which is doing these sort of working capital loans to social enterprises, ventures like Indosol. I wonder if that's actually a pool of capital, to Matt's point, that could be tapped into for funding the sorts of businesses that you're running.
Great, thank you. Last question from my side. For both of you guys, is there anything that you wanted to answer and we haven't asked you yet?
I feel like we covered capitalism, market economics. No. Oh God, I don't know. No.
I think we covered everything. I mean, this was like, what, a Joe Rogan podcast length, right? So.
Yeah. Great, so guys, huge round of applause. Thank you. Thank you so much for spending the morning with us. We know your time is precious. We deeply thank you for that. Thank you guys for spending the morning with us. Really appreciate it. Again, it's a super important conversation to have. Bring this home. Bring this to your family members. Bring this to your friends. And stick around to talk to Massi and Matt a little more if you can. And to all the people as well. So thank you so much, and we look forward to seeing you guys in the next Scale Climate Action.
Just before you head up, not only for Green School parents, but also for our external audience, next week, on Monday and Tuesday, we have the Green Stones, so that's the capstones projects from our grade 12s, where actually they are presenting a lot of, it's really interesting to see the mindset that the kids are leaving Green School, and we're gonna have here at the bridge, there's gonna be live streaming, so for the first time ever, we're gonna be kind of expand a little bit more the audience, so if you wanna come connect and hear what these young minds are presenting as projects to scale climate action, some of them, please come, Monday, Tuesday, next week, the whole day. Thank you so much for coming, for everything that you guys have shared. It's beautiful, the work that you guys have been doing. I actually was thinking about your mom, and thinking about the moms, and they always know, and I was just thinking of connecting the Kiva, with like your mom's idea of how can we connect people that want to, like people like us that maybe want to give 500, 600 to a small producer. So I don't know, just an idea that I want to sit there, and thanks everybody. Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, never mess with her mom, and she always is right. And thank you everybody for being here today. Thank you, Renato, for organizing. And the bridge next year, it's going to be building also a new space. We are getting a new space. The students are redesigning this space, and we're going to be rebuilding. There is going to be some action, but it's going to be quite different. but we still want to be pretty much foresting situations like today, like events like the Scale Climate Action. So I hope to see a lot of you here for next semester, and thank you for being here with us. Thank you.
Thank you.